When a narcissistic pattern and what's often described as a dark empath first come into contact, the interaction doesn't start with conflict, it starts with recognition. And not the kind of recognition most people are used to. This isn't about shared interests or surface-level compatibility. It's a recognition of capability. Both are highly attuned to social dynamics but in different ways. The narcissistic pattern is oriented toward control, status, and validation. It scans for responsiveness, who reacts, who admires, who can be influenced. It's less about understanding the other person deeply, and more about identifying where attention and leverage can be gained. The dark empath, on the other hand, is oriented toward perception. It reads emotional nuance, detects shifts in tone, and identifies underlying motivations quickly. It doesn't just see what's being presented, it picks up on what's driving it. So when these two meet, something immediate happens. The narcissist recognizes someone who is engaged, perceptive, and responsive, someone who reacts in a way that suggests depth. That creates interest. Attention increases. The interaction becomes more focused, more intentional. At the same time, the dark empath recognizes something else. They see the need for validation, the patterns of self-focus, the subtle attempts to steer the interaction. And instead of rejecting it outright, they often engage with it because they understand it. They know how to respond in a way that keeps the interaction moving. This creates a very specific kind of momentum. The conversation feels dynamic, almost accelerated. There's a sense of intensity, not necessarily emotional in the beginning, but structural. Each person is responding in a way that keeps the other engaged. One is projecting, the other is calibrating. One is seeking control, the other is reading how that control is being applied. And because both are operating with a high level of awareness, just in different directions, the interaction feels unusually compelling. This aligns with behavioral observations often discussed by Chase Hughes that people are drawn to those who can match or exceed their level of social intelligence. When someone responds at the same level of awareness, the interaction becomes more engaging, more stimulating, and often more difficult to step away from. But this initial attraction is not built on stability. It's built on mutual engagement with influence. Each person is, in a different way, interacting with the other system. The narcissist is testing for responsiveness and control. The dark empath is observing, adjusting, and maintaining alignment where it serves the interaction. And because both are skilled in maintaining engagement, the early phase can feel unusually strong. There's flow, there's attention, there's a sense that the interaction is operating at a higher level than typical exchanges. But underneath that, the foundation is already forming. Not connection in the traditional sense, but a dynamic built on recognition of influence, response, and control. And that's what makes it different from the start. Because when attraction is built on mutual awareness of how influence works, it doesn't move toward simplicity, it moves toward complexity. And the moment you recognize that, you stop confusing intensity with compatibility and start seeing the structure behind the connection. Once that initial recognition creates momentum, the interaction begins to organize itself around a central force, control, not in an obvious confrontational way at first, but as an underlying structure that shapes how both people engage. Because neither side is passive, the narcissistic pattern moves toward control through assertion. It pushes, it sets the tone, introduces direction, and looks for ways to establish dominance within the interaction. This can show up as confidence, decisiveness, even charisma, but underneath it, there's a consistent effort to find the frame, to determine what matters, how things are interpreted, and where the attention goes. The dark empath, however, doesn't meet that force directly. Instead of pushing back, they redirect. They observe where the interaction is going and make small adjustments that subtly influence its direction. They allow certain elements to continue while quietly shifting others. It's less about resistance and more about positioning. And this is where the dynamic becomes layered. Because now you have two different methods operating at the same time. One is applying pressure. The other is absorbing that pressure and reshaping it. One is trying to control through visibility. The other is influencing through subtlety. This creates a hidden power struggle, not one that's openly acknowledged, but one that's constantly active beneath the surface. Each interaction becomes a negotiation not just of ideas or emotions, but of control itself. Who sets the pace? Who defines meaning? Who adjusts or remains fixed? This aligns with behavioral principles often discussed by Chase Hughes that control in human interaction is rarely static. It shifts based on who is more aware of the dynamic, who adapts more effectively, and who maintains consistency under pressure. And that's what makes this pairing complex. Because the narcissist expects control to be maintained through repetition. The same strategies, applied consistently, have worked before. But the dark empath doesn't respond in predictable ways. They adjust. They change timing, tone, and engagement based on what they observe in real time. So the usual methods don't always produce the same results. And when expected outcomes don't occur, the dynamic intensifies. The narcissistic pattern may increase pressure, more assertion, more attempts to reestablish control. The dark empath in response may become even more refined, less visible in their influence, more precise in how they guide the interaction. And now the exchange is no longer simple. It's not just communication, it's strategy. Every response carries intention. Every pause has meaning. Every shift in tone or direction is part of a larger pattern of influence and adjustment. And because much of this happens beneath the surface, it can feel confusing from the inside. There's engagement but also tension. Flow but also resistance, and that's the defining feature. Because when two different methods of control operate simultaneously, the interaction doesn't stabilize. It evolves into a constant negotiation of influence. And the moment you see that clearly, you stop trying to resolve the interaction and start understanding the system that's driving it. As this dynamic continues to evolve, a subtle imbalance begins to emerge, one that isn't immediately visible but becomes increasingly influential over time. And it comes down to perception, because while both individuals are engaged in the same interaction, they are not processing it with the same depth of emotional awareness. The narcissistic pattern tends to operate with a focus on surface-level signals: what is being said, how attention is shifting, where validation is coming from, and how control is being maintained. It's highly effective at reading reactions, but less consistent when it comes to understanding the deeper emotional structure behind those reactions. In contrast, the dark empath is operating on multiple layers at once. They're not just hearing the words, they're tracking tone, timing, inconsistency, hesitation. They're noticing what changes, what repeats, what doesn't align. And from that, they're forming a much more detailed model of the other person's behavior. This creates an asymmetry, because one side is engaging based on immediate feedback while the other is building a broader pattern over time. One is responding to what is visible, the other is interpreting what is underlying. And that difference creates an advantage, not necessarily in a dramatic or confrontational way, but in prediction. The dark empath begins to anticipate reactions before they happen. They recognize when pressure is about to increase, when a shift in tone is coming, when a certain behavior is about to repeat. And once you can predict a pattern, you can position yourself around it. This aligns with behavioral observations often discussed by Chase Hughes, that the ability to identify patterns early allows for more effective control of timing and response. When you're not reacting in the moment but preparing ahead of it, your actions become more precise. So instead of being caught in the interaction, the dark empath begins to operate slightly ahead of it. They adjust before the shift fully occurs. They respond in ways that reduce the effectiveness of predictable behaviors. They may allow certain patterns to play out, not because they're unaware, but because they're observing how they unfold. And this is where the dynamic becomes even more complex. Because from the outside, it may still look balanced. Both are engaged, both are interacting, both are influencing in different ways, but internally the processing is not equal. One is navigating the interaction as it happens. The other is mapping it while it happens. And that difference creates leverage. Not necessarily to dominate, but to understand. And understanding, when it's consistent, becomes a form of quiet control. It allows one side to reduce unpredictability, to manage responses more effectively, to maintain a level of stability even when the interaction itself becomes unstable. But here's the critical point. This advantage only exists as long as it remains conscious, because the moment awareness drops, the dynamic can shift again, and that's what defines this stage. Because when one person sees the pattern more clearly than the other, they don't just participate in the interaction, they begin to understand how it's being constructed in real time. And once you understand the structure, you're no longer reacting to the interaction, you're navigating it with intention. As this imbalance in perception becomes more pronounced, the nature of conflict begins to change. What might have started as ordinary disagreements, differences in opinion, tone, or expectation no longer stay at that level. The interaction evolves into something more structured, more deliberate. Conflict becomes strategic, because at this point both individuals are no longer just reacting to what's being said, they're responding to what the interaction represents. Every disagreement becomes an opportunity to reassert control, to reshape the frame, or to test how much influence is still in place. For the narcissistic pattern, conflict often intensifies in a direct way. The goal is to reestablish dominance within the interaction. This can show up as escalation, contradiction, reframing, or attempts to shift focus away from vulnerability and back toward control. The conflict isn't just about the issue it's about position. Who defines reality in this moment? The dark empath, however, approaches conflict differently. Instead of escalating outwardly, they often move inward. They analyze the structure of the disagreement. What triggered it? What pattern is being repeated? Where is the pressure being applied? And based on that, they begin to respond in a way that is less about winning the argument and more about influencing its direction. This is where conflict becomes less emotional and more calculated, not in a cold or detached sense, but in a precise one. Words are chosen carefully. Timing becomes deliberate. Silence is used when it's more effective than speech. And instead of reacting to every point, the response is focused on the parts of the interaction that actually shift the dynamic. This aligns with behavioral principles often discussed by Chase Hughes that in high-stakes interactions, the outcome is rarely determined by intensity. It's determined by control of the frame. Whoever defines what the conflict means ultimately shapes how it unfolds. So the argument is no longer just about content, it's about interpretation. One side may try to expand the conflict, introduce new elements, increase emotional pressure. The other may narrow it, redirect it, or allow certain points to pass without engagement. These are not random choices, they're strategic adjustments based on how each person is trying to manage control. And over time, this creates a very specific kind of tension because resolution becomes secondary. The interaction doesn't move toward agreement, it moves toward positioning. Each exchange is less about solving the issue and more about maintaining or shifting influence. From the outside, this can look confusing. There are conversations, there are responses, there are moments of apparent understanding, but the underlying structure doesn't stabilize. The same patterns return, just in slightly different forms. The same dynamics repeat even when the surface content changes. That's the signal. Because when conflict becomes strategic, it stops being about what's being argued and starts being about what's being controlled. And once you see that clearly, you stop trying to win the argument and start questioning whether the interaction itself is worth continuing. By the time the interaction reaches this stage, mutual recognition, competing methods of control, asymmetry in perception, and strategic conflict, the outcome is no longer determined by intensity or personality. It comes down to something far more precise: awareness. Not who is stronger, not who is louder, not even who is more intelligent in a general sense, but who becomes more aware of the dynamic itself. Because as long as both individuals remain inside the interaction, responding, adjusting, reacting, the system continues. It feeds on participation. It evolves through engagement. And in that state, even high levels of perception can be used to maintain the dynamic rather than step out of it. This is where the distinction becomes critical. The narcissistic pattern tends to rely on repetition. The same strategies, the same methods of control, the same ways of regaining position. They may adjust slightly depending on the situation, but the core approach remains consistent. And because it has worked before, there's an expectation that it will continue to work. The dark empath, however, operates through adaptation. They adjust in real time. They shift tone, timing, and engagement based on what they observe. And this gives them flexibility within the interaction, but it also creates a risk. Because constant adaptation can keep them engaged in the system longer than necessary. They become skilled at navigating the dynamic, but not always at exiting it. And that's where awareness becomes the deciding factor. Not awareness of the other person, but awareness of the pattern itself. The recognition that the interaction is not moving toward ability, that it is structured around control, influence, and repetition, that regardless of who is winning in individual moments, the overall system remains unchanged. This aligns with behavioral insights often emphasized by Chase Hughes, that the highest level of control is not found in dominating an interaction, but in choosing whether to remain in it at all. When you can see the structure clearly, you gain the ability to step outside of it. And that's the shift. Because as long as the goal is to influence, outmaneuver, or manage the other person, the interaction continues. It may evolve, it may become more refined, but it doesn't resolve. It stays active because both sides are still engaged in maintaining or adjusting the dynamic. But the moment one person steps back, not reactively, not emotionally, but with clarity, the system begins to lose its structure. Because it requires participation to function. And this is where the outcome is truly decided, not by who controlled more moments, not by who understood more patterns, but by who recognized that the pattern itself was the problem, and chose to disengage from it. Because the highest form of awareness is not just seeing what's happening, it's understanding what it leads to. And when you see that clearly enough, you stop trying to win the dynamic and start deciding whether it deserves your presence at all.